This is the Age Case. Make sure you like and subscribe and hit the bell. The Dunning-Kruger effect is part of the illusionary truth effect regime. It's a tendency of an individual to believe something, whether it's true or valid, if it has been repeated multiple times, or if it's just easier to process, regardless of whether it's true. Or then these people will move on to creating a confirmation bias around themselves, from which they can then spread their information and build up a bigger group of people. This then creates social proof tendency, which is the tendency of people to think and act as others around them do, primarily because of their socially based validation, and people will then accept them in their, what we call an echo chamber, is where everyone sits in a room and they all believe in the same practice, and anyone who tries to question anything that they believe in, then that person is attacked or ignored any of their information, because they're not part of that echo chamber and they haven't created confirmation bias or the illusionary truth effect. Then after the echo chambers are created, conservation tendency is what is known as the belief bias. It's the resistance to revise one's beliefs and perspectives when presented with new evidence. Even though people will come along and show them a different way or evidence or something which they can scrutinize and disprove themselves, they tend to not and just ignore it. That's when the selective exposure theory comes in, which is often used in the media and communication, but individuals do it themselves, where they favor a certain part of information and then push that out. And that's when the continued influence bias happens, where previously learned information and new evidence comes along is just ignored. They will then try and promote that evidence, which is a form of obscurantism, where they're just promoting what they believe is to be true, whether it's the truth or not, and they try to stop people from researching and disproving what they believe to be true. And then this goes round in a circle, where people say they did my own research when really they watched someone else's shitty YouTube video and then just created their own confirmation bias around this, an echo chamber, and then selectively pushing out information which bolsters this echo chamber and confirmation bias that they've created. And people like to throw around words like cognitive dissonance as some form of weaponized way of attacking someone because their beliefs are totally different from the others. Here's an example of how stories are made up, protected, and then spread around by those that made them up. N.M. Rothschild Bank set the first gold fixing twice a day from 1990 to 2003. Mr. A tells Mr. B that the Rothschilds set the gold prices and stole some along the way. Mr. B tells Mr. D the Rothschilds set the prices, stole some, and put it on the stock market. Also, Mr. C tells Mr. D Nathan Rothschild bought lots of stock on the market. Mr. D writes a blog in 2003 that Nathan Rothschild frauded and stole from the government. Mr. E reads this blog. Mr. E makes a video of the website that the Rothschilds own all the banks and set up the Fed Reserve. People like David Icke come along and then research and spread this information to a large network of people who will spread Icke's embellishments without researching. To many discussions, embellishments, and years of being passed around without much critical and deep research, you then come up with this: the Rothschilds own all the central banks, all the gold, have 700 trillion, and fund both sides of war. This is what is made up. And then when Mr. Z comes along to spread this information, he is met with opposition from Mr. X, as Mr. X has done his deep research and can back up most of his claims. But Mr. Z is part of an echo chamber which created confirmation bias around all their information, and they will defend that information, as they have created an echo chamber and confirmation bias around this information that they have been studying, and then they will go out with selective exposure and obscurantism and pass this information round as if it's the truth and what they believe, and anyone who goes against this will be cast out. So there are many forms of misinformation that's weaponized and turned into fake news, satire, propaganda, misleading or out of context information, conspiracy theory and clickbait. Conspiracy theory is when information is packaged as legitimate and people believe it and they hold it dear to their heart, not knowing that it's mainly false. Clickbait is obviously when you click on something and there's a news story that looks real and you then spread it around. You've also got satire, where it's just joking and taking the piss, and then there's propaganda, which is purposely obviously put out there by the government or corporations or individuals, and this all contrives the fake news circle that people just keep regurgitating, spreading around without actually doing any research.